you can turn in your Bibles to Mark this morning. That's the first passage that we'll be looking at, Mark chapter 14. And then we're going to look at three different passages, Mark, Acts, and Second Timothy. We'll be weaving those together. But as often happens, it starts out with a hunting story of me and my brother-in-law. We have done so many things in order to get these wily little deer. I don't understand why we do these sort of things. But this particular story comes from a morning when we got on the road to drive to the hunting site, which was 3 hours before sunrise. We left 3 hours before sunrise because it was a 2-hour drive. You want to get there an hour beforehand so you can walk in the dark before the deer. You're going to stir them or wake them up or anything like that before they can see. We had a 2-hour drive to get there, and we wanted our hunting to be at those hunting spots, and so we left early. Now, unfortunately for us, we didn't check the weather forecast to see that it would be snowing, which would turn to rain through the morning. Well, as you can imagine, sitting in that sort of weather for hours at a time is like torture. By 9 o'clock in the morning, I didn't want to be the first person to go back to the truck. I didn't want to be the person that gave up early, right? But I was. I made my way back to the truck. But here's the encouraging thing. My brother-in-law showed up about 5 minutes later. He was just as desperately cold. He's like, we're getting out of here. We're going to find a laundromat or something. I'm like, well, a laundromat? What are we going to do? We don't have clothes to change into. Well, in no way was I going to argue with that, even if I was curious about what we were going to do. We had these thick, heavy clothes, right, that we're wearing, all sopping wet right now. It was still early enough in the morning, though, that barely anyone was moving in this small town. So we made our way to a laundromat, to the farthest corner of the laundromat, and stripped down to our insulated underwear, the long underwear, the thermal underwear, and put all of our clothes inside this dryer and, dried all of those. Then we, as those finished up drying, we went into the bathroom and put those on and then put our long underwear in, and boom, we came out warm. It was shocking. Well, this genius plan worked so effectively that we dried our inner layers as well as our outer layers without getting arrested for public indecency. I mean, the lengths we will go to for those silly deer. Well, this morning we're looking at another person who had strike one, which was the naked guy in the garden. I imagine John Mark was doing something very similar to our hunting experience the night before Jesus' crucifixion. But I'm not sure how deer fit into his story. But nonetheless, I do wonder if he was in the middle of washing and drying his clothes on this particular day. And I'll explain that as we go through. Let's take a look together at Mark chapter 15 to put together these pieces of John Mark's story. And you'll see that I'm interchanging John Mark and Mark. It's the same person. He was known early on in his career by John, his Hebrew name, and then he took Mark, his Roman name, a little bit later. So let's turn to page 1093 in the Pew Bibles here, and we'll read together verses 51 and 52 of Mark chapter 14. Not 50. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Very short passage, but may the Lord bless his word to our hearing here this morning. There will be a few other passages that we'll look at as well. As you look into the context of this chapter, you will see that this was the night that Jesus was betrayed into the hands of the Romans. They accused him of blasphemy, or the Jews accused him of blasphemy, and so they had this charge brought that he should be put to death because of that blasphemy. That's what their law said, even though that wasn't the law of the Romans. And this is what happened, that he was put to death because of this. Now, this particular scene takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, it is very curious that this young man was only girded about by a linen cloth. Very likely that this was the author of this gospel, Mark, that we know of, or John Mark, but this unnamed scene likely indicates that it's the same young man, almost as though this was his little signature. Yep, that was me. I wouldn't write that about anybody else, but I would write that about me. There was a young man who was naked, and they pulled off his garment, and he ran away naked. John Mark, now he was the cousin of Barnabas and a very close friend of Peter, so that Peter calls him my son in 1 Peter 5:13. He was very close to Peter. This likely indicates that Peter brought him to faith. That's why he called him my son. Now, that being said, Acts 12:12 tells us that Mark was the son of Mary, who had a large house with a portico, a nice large porch where people met. And that's the story what we have of the servant girl, Rhoda, who, when Peter knocked on the door, she was so shocked that it was Peter that she didn't open the door. And she ran inside and said, "It's Peter. He's out there." "Well, did you let him in?" "No, I forgot." And that's the servant girl. So we get the sense that this was a large house with this portico where there were people there. It was one of the early house churches in Jerusalem. There was a servant girl. This was a family of means. This was a family where he had money. In fact, when we even read that he had a linen cloth about him, linen was expensive. It was soft. It was tightly woven. And so we can see that this was an expensive thing. And I really think that John Mark was doing the same thing. He was right between washing and drying. He had his regular clothes, but he couldn't put those on. They weren't quite dry yet. And so he wore a linen cloth, at least to have something. And that's what we find him in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this makes it all the more curious why he had a linen sheet about him, but the only logical conclusion I can see is that John Mark's clothes were in the washing machine or in the drying machine at the laundromat, just like me. Now, let's not miss the point, though. John Mark was naked under that linen sheet, which soon became all too apparent as the soldiers pulled off the only thing that they could grab hold of as he was trying to run away. This was not a highlight for this upscale young man. You could say that it was an inauspicious beginning for his upcoming career in the church. The fact of the matter is that none of us gets it right from the first day of ministry. We're all like John Mark. None of us has an unblemished record without moments of embarrassment when we admit, if we're honest, I'd rather have a do-over. Can I get a mulligan on that one? That shot just wasn't my best. I'd like to just do. I'm sure John Mark would have liked to use his one mulligan as he ran home naked, get a fresh change. You're not defined by your words. Stay faithful. Well, we turn now to strike two against John Mark. John Mark's most embarrassing moment was a circumstance that was largely out of his control. On the other hand, sometimes we just plain mess up of our own accord. That's what we see in Mark's next episode. Let's take a look. And this is in Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 40. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they are." They had gone on a missionary journey together. They had gone to these different cities, and they wanted to go back and see how those churches were doing. Now, Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take him with them, the one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to work. there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace. Now, there's a lot of detail that's buried in the history of the book of Acts. So let's unpack some of this so that we can see more clearly what is happening here. Paul's first missionary journey started out from his hometown of Antioch, as you can see on the map here. So that's where Antioch is. That's where they started out. Now, the next step, or the next stop for Paul and Barnabas and Mark together was to go to Cyprus, where Barnabas was from and where Mark was from. So they went from Paul's area, they were sent out from that area, and then they went to Cyprus, where Barnabas and Mark would be sent out from the people that knew them. So what happened there must have been pretty exciting. I mean, I just got to say, it was pretty exciting because at Paphos, the far end of Cyprus, there's a man named Sergius Paulus, a Roman proconsul, a man in a government official position who accepted the Lord. People must have been really excited. Paul, Barnabas, and Mark must have been thrilled. They must have been riding cloud nine. I can't believe it. A Roman official accepted the Lord under our ministry. God is going to do great things on this trip. He's sending us off at the very beginning with that sort of launch. Well, the very next city, the first city outside of their home areas, Mark decides to bail. He gives up and refuses to go with Paul and Barnabas into the interior lands that are off the beaten path, that are outside and foreign to them. Chickened out. This is when things got tough, as the next city of Antioch in Pisidia included intense opposition to the gospel. Not the same Antioch as before. This is the one interior. In the next city of Iconium, Paul and Barnabas had to flee a plot to kill them. The next city, they were mistaken for gods and nearly lynched. The next city, Paul was driven out of town and stoned so badly that the people that stoned him said, well, he's dead. Let's just, enough. And that's what the two of them had to endure without the help Mark had abandoned. You can see the emotional damage that this would have caused. Paul, who was enduring this without the guy who had backed out. So, in one way, we could see how Barnabas had a point that Mark had started out on the first missionary journey with them. He went to the first 4 cities. So when the time came for a second missionary journey, he wanted to take Mark along. Maybe he wanted to give him another chance to go to the same places that he had given up on before. Wouldn't that be an awesome story of healing and restoration, that a missionary faced his fears and went back to the same cities for successful ministry? On the other hand, Paul nearly lost his life, and Mark was nowhere to be found. We can see Paul's side of things, that he wasn't going to put himself in that position again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, on me. Shame on me for putting myself in that position again. Paul was having none of it. In fact, their disagreement was so big that it was called a paroxysm. To translate that into the language of rural Wisconsin, they had a conniption fit. Jerry tries to pick out a key word as a synopsis to each one of my sermons. Well, Jerry, here it is, conniption. Okay? Conniption is your word of the day. So what is this conniption all about? We don't know for certain. We don't know for certain, but we can put together a few. John Mark had 2 names that he was known by. John, as I mentioned, was his Hebrew name. That was the name that he used in the early part of the book of Acts. That's what we know him as, was John. who is known as Mark. But then we also know that he had Mark, the Roman name. We also know that he was very close to this controversy that took place at this time that had arisen over whether non Jews had to become Jews before they became Christians. That was the controversy that was taking place. This issue was so big, in fact, that in Galatians 2, it recounts how Barnabas was led astray in the hypocrisy of believing that non Jews had to become Jews before they became Christians. And Paul confronted him to his in front of other people. An end to this. So we know that Barnabas and Paul and Mark, John Mark, very close to this. Finally, considering that this was going then into the interior from Pamphylia, this would be the first time that Mark had to come face to face with the reality of this issue. If they were going to see people come to faith, and if there was a difference of opinion between him and Paul on such a foundational issue, you can bet that the pressure cooker environment of missions will bring that surface. It will make that small crack into a widening fissure. That is likely what this conniption was all about. But we know for certain that it was so huge that they decided it's better to completely part ways than to continue to try to work. And these were both men who were called apostles. The Bible. It was broken. Their relationship was broken because of the impetuous departure of John Mark. He was at fault for breaking up the dynamic duo of Paul and Barnabas. That is a lot of weight for a young man. And a young man who was probably a teenager. Barnabas took Mark and went to their homeland of Cyprus. They were never mentioned again. Paul took Silas and went the exact opposite direction to Syria. He didn't cross over into Cyprus to follow that same track, to go back and visit all of the churches. He went to Syria instead. He went the exact opposite direction. This is what is defined as a crucial conversation by Kerry Patterson. A crucial conversation has three characteristics. First of all, the stakes are high. Second, there is a difference of opinion. And third, emotions are involved. Now, we can recognize those as crucial conversations. They're conversations that have to be had, but boy, it's going to be uncomfortable. It is going to be uncomfortable when we encounter this. The stakes are high, first of all. It's not over little menial things. It's over some serious stuff. There's a difference of opinion. You think one thing, I think something else. And emotions are high. It angers me that you think this. It angers me that you did this. It angers me that John Mark left us and abandoned us. I've encouraged friends and family members or couples in counseling sessions use this book by Kerry Patterson as a guide to working through intractable problems. Keep talking. Keep moving forward. Don't give in to the isolation that the enemy wants us to draw in. Evidently, the Apostle Paul hadn't read Patterson's book, so this resulted in a major rift. But even through that rift, we can learn some things. We can learn some things from Paul and Barnabas' relationship. We can learn that they did keep talking. They hadn't read the book, but they did keep working at the intractable problems in front of them. Secondly, they didn't come to a resolution, so they let it rest. There was a time where they said, okay, we're going to let this rest. I'm not going to continue to be bitter against you. I'm going to let this sit as it is. However, they still remained in contact, as we see in Galatians chapter 2, like I mentioned, where Paul and Barnabas are still in the same circles, in the same room, talking over the same issues. They're still connected. They're still talking about the very thing that seems to have divided them. Finally, never think that your problems are so severe that God cannot fix them. Never give up entirely. We see this incredible example lived out in the relationship of Paul and Mark. Now, you are not defined by your worst day. Stay faithful. So, strike one, strike two. Does that make any difference of when you knock out a home run out of the park? Even if you have two strikes against you, you can hit a home run, right? It makes no difference whatsoever if it's the first pitch that you receive, or the second pitch that you receive, or the fifth pitch that you receive, as long as they're balls and strikes and you're still in the batter's box. You can still knock it out of the park, and that's what John Mark does. For this point, we move forward a few years. In fact, it was 2 years between the time that Mark abandoned Paul and Silas, and now we move forward 11 years to the writing of 2 Timothy. Now, 2 Timothy is one of Paul's prison letters. In other words, he is in the thick of the persecution that he would face. At any point, in fact, something crazy could happen where the emperor just decides, kill all those prisoners that we're holding. And that could be it. That's the end of it. His life could go away like that at any moment. That's where we read following from 2 Timothy 4, verses 9 through 11. Do your best to come to me. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone with me. Get Mark. Bring him with you. Paul is writing to Timothy to urge him to come soon. Then, when you know it, Paul says that Demas deserted him. So Paul has this, I don't know, he's putting himself in a position maybe that other people just can't go along with. But certainly John Mark abandoned him. John Mark deserted him. Now Demas as well has deserted him. In the way that Paul says it, he fell in love with this world, with the things of this present world, and he abandoned us here. Paul is dealing with the desertion of fellow workers. Then he lists two more workers. He doesn't quite say that they deserted him, but nonetheless they left. They left and moved on, which leaves Paul alone. Paul and Luke are there, but they had left him alone nonetheless. Crescens and Titus have moved on so that only Luke remains. In the midst of recounting of desertion of Demas and departure of Crescens and Titus, Paul brings to mind another deserter, Mark. Not a deserter now, is he? It's been 13 years. In that time, Paul brings to mind this deserter. He doesn't even mention the fact, years ago, this earlier fissure that took place that caused him and Barnabas to split. It's like Paul has moved on. Like he had actually forgiven Mark and forgotten about the issue. He didn't take the opportunity to get a jab in to say, yeah, Demas is just like Mark. He abandoned me. He didn't stick it to him one more time. In the middle of this ministry, the issue was big enough to stand his ground 11 years ago and threaten ministry when Paul went an entirely different direction from Paul and Barnabas. When he went the other way into Syria to prove a point, there's forgiveness so deep and so rich that it healed the very source of this massive fissure, this conniption. Have you faced any conniptions of your own doing or of others' doing? Are you in the midst of one now that needs the healing forgiveness that can come through a crucial conversation? Stakes are high. There's a difference of opinion. Emotions are involved. Does that describe anything you are facing? Someone else? Would you like help walking through that situation? I'll just avail myself to that now. If you would like help in one of those situations, either advice or to be a mediator and work through that, I would love to be a part of it. So, the one thing that you can do as a result of this sermon, you know how I ask you every time, what are you going to do about this? You might say, Pastor Dave, I'm facing one of those intractable situations. I just don't know what my next step should be. Be a mediator and take that first step. Don't let the situation go 13 years before you see the healing that is available to you. If it has already gone 13 years, what are you waiting for that will change, that will make it so that you do wrestle it to the ground and deal with it? Mark recognized that he couldn't go on like he had. Paul recognized that he couldn't simply accept the status quo. They buried the hatchet. In fact, Mark became a very close traveling companion to Peter and accompanied him to Rome. When we read the gospel account of Mark, what we're actually reading is Peter's gospel account. Mark was with him in Rome, telling him all of the stories, laying this out so that it could be written down. He was with Peter to the very end. He didn't abandon Peter. Even when Peter was crucified upside down, Mark. In fact, he was known as Mark. If that was the dividing issue of whether non-Jews had to become Jews before becoming Christians, here's a Jew, John, who adopts his Roman name, Mark, as a symbol. This is how I'm going to be known at this point. If the source of this fissure between him and Paul was whether non-Jews had to become Jews to become Christians, Mark switched his opinion to such a degree that he took on only his non-Jewish, and was known for that for the rest of his life. After the death of Peter, Mark returned to his homeland of Cyprus, where he remained until the death of Barnabas, which was at least after AD 57. Eventually, Mark made his way to Alexandria, Egypt, the intellectual center of the early church, and he founded the church there. He became its first bishop and eventually was martyred there in the of Nero, AD. John Mark started the ball rolling to record for us an accurate account of the life of Jesus. His gospel was the first gospel to be written down. This young man who had the inauspicious beginning as a teenager in the Garden of Gethsemane had an incredible impact on the founding of the church. His gospel is the shortest, but by all accounts, the other writers fleshed out details based on his gospel. It's very clear that they had his gospel in front of them, and they were like, oh, and I'm going to add this detail as well. Mary says this about the story in the first few years before Jesus, even was presented at the temple, and then later on, John comes in and adds his details. But Mark started the ball rolling. What a treasure from the foibles. What a treasure that we benefit from on a daily basis, because this young man, you are not defined by your worst days. So what are you going to do about this? How will it affect your life? Who are you going to tell? Now, I've been thinking about how to include questions, and I do want to include questions, but they're going to be 1 week later. So I'm going to ask them right at this point so that you're not all left standing when I'm answering this. And here's the question. Why are names in the Bible important? Well, first, names can be identifiers of characteristics or even of prophecies that people have. As we've seen today, names can indicate a major change in a person's life. We see that in John and moving to Mark. We see that in Saul moving to Paul. We see that in Levi moving to Matthew. We see that in Simon moving to Peter. As far as the long list of Bible names that we have in the Bible, they're a sign of heritage. In fact, they're like the first blockchain because they ensure that nothing can be injected, nothing can be changed in the middle because we have that whole list of names. So names are definitely. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for the name of John Mark. Thank you for this young man, how even as a teenager, Lord, he had zeal, and in some ways he misplaced that zeal. But nonetheless, Lord, you changed his direction to bring that back to something that honored you in deep measure. And Lord, the impact that he had on the Christian world is hard to underestimate, hard to overestimate. Lord Jesus, I pray that we would be those people that look at that sort of impact and that we want to have that sort of impact ourselves, starting with those relationships where maybe we've encountered a connection. In Jesus' name.